Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing another part to the psychological horror movie Iceberg. Now I'm not going to be doing an Iceberg video every single week. I know I'm doing 2 in a row just because that was a little bit easier for me in these past couple weeks, but next week I will be getting back to the podcast. But as for today, I'm going to try to get through tiers 2 and 3. And as per usual, I will have linked down below the original Iceberg as well as the letterbox list that I created that has all of the movies that I could find. Let's stop wasting time and get into the Iceberg. Starting off with another movie that is based on a Stephen King story is 1408 or 1408. The 2007 film is directed by Michael Hafstrom and stars Samuel L. Jackson and John Cusack. In this film, John Cusack plays Mike Enslin, who is an author who investigates different, haunted locations. When he goes to investigate a hotel in New York called the Dolphin, he gets a warning not to enter the room 1408. But of course, because he has to investigate, he goes in to investigate. This film is like a lot of films where someone is skeptical of something being haunted, where John Cusack's character spends the entire time being like, I don't think this is real, but then a bunch of weird stuff starts happening and he starts to lose his mind about it. Now, I haven't seen the film, but just from the trailer, I feel like John Cusack is just one of those people who just kind of looks funny. So, everything that he does has some weird, humor to it without him intending it to be humorous, but that's just my opinion. The next 2 films are Creep and Creep 2. Creep is a 2014 found footage style film directed by Mark Duplass and starring Mark Duplass and Patrick Bryce. I've actually talked about the first one on my channel before, so if you want to, you can view that in my reviews. This is one of those films that definitely doesn't really have as much horror as much as it really is just like a psychological thriller. It's a really fun film if you like found footage and sort of more realistic horror because there's definitely creepy things about it, but it's definitely not scary. Essentially, the film follows Patrick Bryce's character, Aaron, as he is going to do a job that he found online to be a videographer for this man who is apparently dying of cancer, and he wants to leave this film for his son to watch after he's born. However, as the day goes on, he starts learning more weird things about this guy, and it just becomes kind of crazy. And the second one is just a continuation of following Mark Duplass's character. The next film is the 2014 film Goodnight Mommy. The Austrian film is directed by Veronika Franz and Severin Fiala. At least I think that's how you pronounce it. And Elias and Lucas Schwartz. The film follows the twin boys as their mother returns home from the hospital, and when she returns home, she's covered completely in bandages, and as time goes along, they start to wonder if the woman under the bandages is actually their mother, because the way that she's acting is not quite the way they think that their own mother would act. This is a film that's been on my watch list for a couple of months, especially because it also has a remake starring Naomi Watts. The film Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is a 1986 film starring Michael Rooker and directed by John McNaughton. The film had a hard time getting picked up because of its graphic nature, and it makes sense because it does follow this man named Henry as he pretty much just goes on a killing spree. The main character Henry and his friend Otis are also based on real-life serial killers Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. This definitely seems like one of those films where if you are not into slasher type films or films where there's a lot of violence and seemingly nudity, then I wouldn't recommend it. But if you are into grittier sort of portraits, then this might be the film for you. It Comes at Night is a 2017 psychological horror film written and directed by Trey Edward Schultz and stars an ensemble cast that plays a family that is hiding in the forest after Earth is taken over by a highly contagious disease. I sort of remember when this film came out because I remember thinking it looked kind of scary, but I didn't actually know what it was about. This film looks like it has sort of that gritty, apocalyptic nature type of vibe since they are out in the woods, but it also has sort of like a The Thing vibe where they're scared of something that they can't really see. Jacob's Ladder is a 1990 film directed by Adrian Lyne and starring Tim Robbins. The film follows a man named Jacob who is essentially tormented by his experience in the Vietnam War. So after returning home, he's suffering from PTSD, hallucinations, and just bizarre happenings. And unfortunately, as things get worse, it becomes difficult for him to tell what's real and what's fake. After watching the trailer and reading a little bit about it, it kind of reminds me of the film Conspiracy Theory. I know the vibes are completely different, but if you've seen Conspiracy Theory and you read just a little bit about this film, you might see where I'm making the connection, but I don't want to give anything away, so I'm just going to leave it at that. The Lodge is a 2019 film directed by Veronica Franz and Severin Fiala. If you remember from a few minutes ago, they also directed Goodnight Mommy. However, this film is in English and supposedly somewhere around the United States. The film stars Riley Keough. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. It's Keough, so it could be pronounced differently, so I'm sorry for butchering it. But her character is a young woman who ended up being the sole survivor of an extremist cult that decided to take their own lives, and she ends up in a relationship where she is the fiance to a man that has 2 children. And for Christmas, they decide to go to sort of a secluded lodge where whenever the father decides to leave to go do something, she's left with the 2 children, and weird things start to happen around the lodge. And of course, her having dealt with a lot of trauma and religious trauma, it gets very creepy very quickly. I have mixed feelings about this film because I'm not a huge fan of religious horror, but I actually really want to watch it again just because I know what happens at the end, and so I would like to rewatch it to sort of see how I feel about it the second time. So it's definitely one of those films where if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it because I think you will either love it or hate it. The next one is a film that you've probably heard of, or at least you've heard of sort of the true crime case that it's related to, even though it's kind of not. It's the film Orphan, the 2009 film that stars Isabel Fuhrman. It's directed by Jaume Collet Serra. Again, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it is based on a story by Alex Mace. The film stars Isabel Fuhrman as Esther, who is supposed to be a young orphaned little girl who is adopted by a family. However, they start to realize that something is not right about Esther pretty much from the start. And I feel like that short synopsis doesn't really do the film justice because it definitely, I remember when they were showing ads for this film, I thought it was really creepy, even though when you watch the actual film, it really is just a psychological horror because a lot of the horror aspects are really not anything that is super scary. It's just sort of creepy or jumping out at you. A lot of people associate this film with sort of being like Natalia Grace, who was a young Ukrainian woman who was adopted by a family who believed that she was not actually who she said she was. And if you haven't seen the film Orphan, then I would suggest skipping just a little bit because I'm going to give spoilers. But essentially in Orphan, the young girl is actually an adult woman who just looks like a child. However, in real life, a lot of people think that that is what Natalia Grace is. However, it seems like from medical records that she very clearly was a child who was abandoned and abused by the family that adopted her. And they clearly did it for the looks of adopting a child that they clearly did not want. Especially because Natalia Grace has a lot of medical issues that bar her from being able to grow and walk in the way that a normal child might have been able to at the time, and it's very frustrating to see people still think that those two things are related or that they are the same thing. I just wanted to put that out there because, like, Natalia Grace was straight up abused as a child, and her perpetrators are essentially getting away with it because they were able to legally change her age, even though that's not her biological age. However, there's a lot of information that's still coming out about her case, so I won't say anything is, like, definitive because there's, you know, obviously there could be information that, like, changes my mind about it, but essentially these two things are separate. So Orphan is an interesting story, but it's not real. So, and I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit in the Iceberg because Orphan First Kill, which is like the sequel to Orphan, is also on this tier, which again I think is kind of weird because I feel like a lot of people know what Orphan is, but they don't know about the second movie. But it came out in 2022 and it also stars Isabel Fuhrman. The film was directed by William Brent Bell, and this film is really interesting because it is supposed to take place before the 2009 film, and granted, let me look it up really quick, but I believe that Isabel Fuhrman, yes, she's older than me, which means that in 2009 she would have been like 12 or 13, whereas in 2022 she would have been like 24. So, yeah, she was playing a child when she was 24. It's not to say that she doesn't look young, but, they did a lot of work and overhaul for that movie, and they really didn't need to. However, I did actually like the storyline. I just wished that, maybe they didn't make it into a prequel. Maybe they should have made it into an anthology. I think that would be an interesting sort of anthology to have, like the Orphan anthology, where like we just see a bunch of different situations that are similar to Orphan. That'd be cool. Orphan First Kill is actually a little bit different than the original one. It's not the same exact storyline. However, she does go into the family with the intention of sort of like fooling them, but it sort of flips the whole thing on its head. So I don't know if I would suggest watching it because it's not that good, but I like what they were trying to do. The next film is the 2022 film Pearl, directed by T. West, starring Mia Goth. It's also the sequel to X, which I don't know why X isn't on either of these tiers either. Yeah, I was surprised that X, I don't believe, is on tier 2 or 3. I haven't seen it yet. I really want to see X and Pearl, but essentially Pearl is the sort of prequel, I guess, to the film X, and it's like the origin story of the main character played by Mia Goth. This film is considered to just be a horror film, but I do think that there's obviously like a psychological element because the main character, Pearl, becomes a villain in her desire to become a movie star, and so she commits some heinous acts throughout the film, and I do think that there's not quite a slasher element to it, but definitely like when characters like start just killing people and stuff, I feel like there's a psychological element when they are the main character, but definitely again on my watch list. The next film I think is considered more of a slasher, and again I don't really know why this is on here as a psychological horror film because I feel like slashers have their own category. Like, I would put something like Terrifier into the slasher category because that's essentially what it's supposed to be, even though it has a lot of psychological elements. And so the film Silent Night, Deadly Night, I think would fall into a slasher category. It's a 1984 film directed by Charles E. Sellier Jr. This film actually ended up becoming a series that was cut into multiple parts. It stars Robert Brian Wilson as Billy Chapman, a man who witnessed his children being murdered by Santa and essentially ends up becoming Santa so that he can go on a killing spree, and that's what he does. Next is the 2022 film Smile, directed by Parker Finn and starring Sosie Bacon. The film is considered a psychological supernatural film, and I would agree. It follows Sosie Bacon's character as a therapist named Rose who witnesses a patient take their own life in a very weird way, saying that something is in the room with them, that it's looking at them, and she works in a psychiatric ward, so she's used to people acting sort of strange, but in witnessing this woman take her own life, it sort of sets the stage for the supernatural horror that sort of comes onto her. I remember the marketing for this film was really intense and really creepy because part of what the supernatural entity does is it shows people that you know and even people you don't know smiling creepily at you. And it's a really interesting and cool concept. It kind of has the vibe of It Follows, which I also recently watched and loved. However, the ending had me and a lot of other people sort of disappointed. I definitely think it's up to the person to decide whether or not they like the ending. I personally didn't, but if you want to hear me talk about this movie where I do talk about the ending and my feelings about it, then I can definitely make a review of it. But for now, I'll just let it be that, watch it and you can decide how you feel about the ending. The next film is one that I've heard a lot about, which is Last Night in Soho. The film stars Thomasin McKenzie and Anya Taylor-Joy. The film is considered a psychological horror film that is about a teenager who moves to London to study fashion design and ends up being haunted by a woman named Sandy who lived during the 60s. And I feel like that synopsis doesn't really do the horror aspect of it justice because there's obviously some horror to it, but it seems like one of those more thriller types of aspects rather than horror. I think because there's sort of a hallucination, I don't know, haunting vision type of element to it. It may be considered horror, but yeah, it's definitely something that I want to see, but I've heard that there's been some criticism of it, so I guess it depends on what people think of the ending. I feel like a lot of horror sort of relies on whether the ending is good or not. The next film is yet another film that is still on my watch list, and I almost watched it not that long ago, but I ended up not watching it for some reason, but it's the film Saint Maud. It's a 2019 British psychological thriller directed by Rose Glass starring Morfydd Clark. And it also happens to be Rose Glass's directorial debut, which is great. From what I've heard, it looks like a pretty good movie. It follows a nurse named Katie who ends up seeing one of her patients pass away and ends up joining the Roman Catholic Church, calling herself Maud, and sort of just becoming fixated on saving a patient that she is looking after. This definitely looked interesting to me because it looks like religious horror that isn't just strictly about someone being possessed, but more so about sort of the fixation that comes from the idea of saving someone, along with just sort of the sort of eerie aspect of watching somebody die and that sort of fixation that occurs. The next film is Martyrs. It's a 2015 film directed by Kevin and Michael Getz. It stars Troyan Belisario and Bailey Noble, and it's based on Martyrs by Pascal Laugier. Not sure how to pronounce other last names. And I think the 2008 version is better, to be quite honest. I believe I've talked about one or both of these films in previous videos, but essentially Martyrs is about a young woman who was abused as a child by a specific group of people, And after escaping and being in an orphanage, she makes a friend with another girl. And when they get older, she decides that she's going to get revenge on the people who had abused her when she was a child. And she also is sort of dealing with some demons, I guess, like internal, but also like literally sort of dealing with demons. And her friend from the orphanage has a hard time sort of believing her about these demons. More so, she doesn't seem to be sure if the abuse that took place is actually like exactly what happened. Not so much that it didn't happen, but the details might not be what she thinks they are. And since I've seen both films, they do both have sort of different ways of going about the story itself. Again, I think the 2008 version is like way better. And I like the way that they tell the story a little bit better, but the 2015 version is also like pretty good as well. This film, it does have a lot of psychological aspects to it, but it also has a lot of like graphic violence in both of them. So there's a lot of horror to it. The next film is the 1974 film Deranged, directed by Jeff Gillen and Alan Ormsby, and stars Robert Blossom. This is another one of those sort of like I take ladies and kill them kind of films that is based on Ed Gein, which if you didn't know, he was a murderer in like the 50s in Wisconsin. I don't have anything else to say about the film. The next film is the 1997 film Cube. It's sort of an ensemble cast, so I won't name everyone because there's quite a few people, but it's directed by Vincenzo Natali. This film is actually considered independent sci-fi horror, and it makes sense because the budget was very low, and there's a lot of fictional elements that, yes, may or may not be related to things that science cannot do yet, and it is considered to be kind of scary because it is one of those we have trapped you and you gotta figure it was Saw before Saw, right? But essentially these people are trapped in like a giant cube and they have to figure their way out without getting killed. Again, a very like Saw-like premise. I'm not really sure if I would consider it to be psychological horror. I just feel like there's a lot of other films that could be on this list, and I don't actually know how many people know about Cube, but yeah, if you like a good like little watch, just a fun little watch in your free time, I would recommend Cube. The next film is one that I'm confused as to why it's on here, simply because the first one isn't on here, and it is the sequel to the original Blair Witch, which is Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2. It is directed by Joe Berlinger and stars an ensemble. A bunch of kids go to find the Blair Witch again. But like I said, the Blair Witch Project isn't actually on this list. It was not in tier 1 and it doesn't appear anywhere else. So I'm kind of confused as to why this particular one is on here, especially because it's still considered to just be a horror film and not necessarily a psychological horror film. And I don't even know if I would consider the Blair Witch Project to be a psychological horror film either, so I don't know why this one is on here too. However, the next film actually does make sense as to why it's on here, which is Hannibal, the 2001 film directed by Ridley Scott and starring Anthony Hopkins. It is also a sequel, and it's based on the book by Thomas Harris, but it is the sequel to Silence of the Lambs. This time the film has Julianne Moore as the Clarice Starling FBI agent. However, we focus a lot more on Hannibal Lecter after he has escaped and is living just in hiding in a different country. It follows both Hannibal Lecter as he is out in the world just sort of doing what he does, trying not to kill people and getting noticed, while also following Clarice Starling as she's trying to catch Hannibal before he can be caught by one of the victims that actually survived him, who is extremely rich and wants to find him and kill him. The next film is yet another sequel, and it's The Ring 2. It's the 2005 film directed by Hideo Nakata and starring Naomi Watts. Of course, it is based on the Japanese horror film The Ring, as well as the first one, The Ring. This one is another one that is on my list to watch because I really want to see it. I love Naomi Watts, and of course it follows after the first film as well. It looks like this is one of those sequels where we have people from the previous film that are sort of involved, but also it sort of still follows the sort of original idea of the first film, which is that when somebody watches the tape, like within however many days, I can't remember, like within 7 days, you'll end up dead. A Tale of Two Sisters is a 2003 Korean film directed by Kim Ji-woon and starring Im Soo-jung. It's based on the Korean folktale of the Tale of Two Sisters. The film is considered a psychological horror film with like some traditional horror aspects, but also a lot of like psychological hallucination, sort of vision type of horror to it. The film follows a teenage girl named Sumi after she is released from a mental institution back to her family, where she has a younger sister and her parents, who all seem to be dealing with their own things. This is one of those films that is kind of hard to describe what exactly is going on, simply because there's like nothing and everything going on at the same time, because just saying like a girl returns home and things get kind of like weird when she's there doesn't fully like describe this film. And I am a lover of Korean films, so I'm guessing that this is probably a good film, even though I haven't seen it, but it's also based on a folktale from the Joseon era, so I imagine that it's probably a good story if it's been told for that long. The last film in Tier 2 is the 2023 film directed by M. Night Shyamalan, Knock at the Cabin. This one is sort of an ensemble cast, so there's multiple people, and it's based on a novel by Paul G. Tremblay. The film essentially follows two husbands who take their young daughter to a cabin in the woods for a vacation, and as they are there, they get a knock at the door of this group of people who is telling them that they need to, I think, sacrifice somebody in order to save the world. And even though it sounds crazy at first, they all begin to witness things that they believe are like foretelling the end of the world, or things that are like tragedies that are happening because these people haven't like killed one of their own. And as the story like goes along, we find out like more information about these people and like why they think this. This is one of those films where like it did not look good to me when I first saw the trailer, and I feel like M. Night Shyamalan has like sort of lost his storytelling ability a little bit, because I feel like he's been able to tell like really interesting and hard-hitting stories before, but I feel like in the past like 10 years we just haven't seen anything really good from him. And of course I haven't seen this film, so maybe it is like better than I have heard, but for the most part I haven't heard very many like good things about this film. But that is Tier 2. I'm gonna take a break, and then I will talk about Tier 3. It's the next day, and now I'm gonna do Tier 3. Starting off strong with one that I found a little confusing, because the name of the movie is Delirium, and there were two films of the name Delirium that came out in 2018, so I wasn't really sure which one it was, but I'm assuming it's the one that stars Topher Grace. The film is a psychological horror directed by Dennis Iliadis. Essentially, it follows a man who is recently released from a mental institution and on house arrest, but the house that he goes to is his deceased father's mansion, and so in him having to check in every once in a while via video calls, he kind of just spirals in being in the house. It's one of those you can't tell what's real and what's fake sort of movies. I have to say that Topher Grace is another one of those people like John Cusack to me, where it's hard to take them seriously, not because they're bad at acting or anything, but just because, like, they just don't quite look like they should be in a serious movie for some reason. The other film, named Delirium, is directed by John Martin and stars Mike Manning, Griffin Freeman, and Ryan Pinkston. Essentially, this group of guys goes onto the porch of a haunted house to make a viral video about the haunted house and whatnot, and, like, one of them gets snatched, right? Essentially, it's like the plot of Scary Godmother, except it doesn't result in, like, a cool skeleton butler that's most definitely gay and her very weird werewolf friend showing up. The next two films are Escape Room and Escape Room Tournament of Champions, I believe. Escape Room was released in 2019 and directed by Adam Robitel, and Escape Room Tournament of Champions was released in 2021 but directed by the same guy. These two are films that have more of an ensemble cast, but generally sort of star Taylor Russell. Essentially, it's exactly what you think it is. These people go into an escape room, except for the escape room, the stakes are life and death. And I had mixed feelings about the movie in general. I think the first one is really good. I haven't seen the second one, but I really liked the ending, and I was just kind of surprised by the ending because a lot of it is like, who is behind this whole escape room, because it very much is like these people received the invitation, but it seems like they were specifically picked to go into the escape room. It's not like what you normally do where you book an escape room and like you just play with the people that you also booked it with. Like, these were a bunch of strangers who are called together to be in the escape room. This film was kind of like Saw Light, in my opinion, where you have to, like, get out before you die in some horrendous way. So if you're someone who's not into, like, the gore of Saw and you want something a little more modern, then I would suggest Escape Room. The Girl Next Door is a 2007 film directed by Gregory M. Wilson and stars Blanche Baker, Daniel Manch, and Blythe Offarth. This film is also known as Jack Ketchum's Evil because it's, like, based on a book of the same name. This film was another one where I had a little bit of trouble trying to figure out which one it was. Not because there was one made the same year, but because there are so many movies called The Girl Next Door, but I assumed it was this one because this one is known as a thriller/horror film. So this film is supposed to be based on the life of Sylvia Likens, which, if you didn't know, Sylvia Likens was a young woman who was essentially taken in by a family who tortured and abused her until she passed away. And it is just horrific to hear everything that happened to this young woman, especially because, you know, this happened in a residential area. Like, it was not really much of a secret, especially because there were children from around the neighborhood, as well as the woman that she was staying with. Her children as well took part in hurting her. So the film is supposed to take place sort of from the perspective of the neighbor, so thus the girl next door. And the neighbor in this case is named David, and the girl who is supposed to be like Sylvia is named Meg. But it seems like a lot of the details were very similar. There's also another film that came out the same year in 2007 called An American Crime that depicts the same things as well, the same case. And this one stars Elliot Page and Catherine Keener. It seems like both films may be equally just disturbing. So if you are sensitive to topics such as the abuse of a child, then I would not recommend it. Because I do think that both films are considered sort of graphic. The Haunting in Connecticut 2, Ghosts of Georgia, is a 2013 film loosely based on a true story, directed by Tom Elkins, starring Chad Michael Murray and Emily Allen Lind. I've actually seen this movie. I didn't like it. It's just not my cup of tea. I actually saw the first one as well because there is another one called The Haunting in Connecticut. I actually liked that film a lot better, and I don't really know why that film isn't also on here as well, because they are both supernatural horror type of films. I really don't think that either of them would be considered psychological horror, just because, like, yes, there are some psychological elements to it, but knowing that it has to do with, like, ghosts, it makes it just supernatural in my opinion, because, like, these people questioning their reality very clearly has to do with the fact that, like, people died in their home and or around. This particular movie is obviously Ghosts of Georgia. It's about a family that is moving into a house, or in a house, and it's in Georgia, and the ghosts in this particular film are surrounding like slaves and whatnot, and the sort of underground railroad. So yeah, this film kind of made me uncomfortable in that capacity, partially because, like, it just stars white people, and I don't want to hear white people deal with slave ghosts. That's just weird to me. The next film is a film that got terrible reviews, but I'd still consider it to be a psychological thriller in some capacity, which is Ma, the 2019 film directed by Tate Taylor and starring Octavia Spencer. If you weren't aware, this film is about Octavia Spencer's character, who is an adult woman who becomes obsessed with a bunch of teens. Essentially, she, like, lures them in by letting them party and, like, drink in her basement. Like, she's trying to be one of the kids, but then she gets, like, really seriously attached to them and starts harassing them and following them and things like that to an unhealthy level. However, if you watch the film, if you know anything, because I feel like this film got kind of spoiled, like, and I'm gonna do spoilers here for a sec, but, like, I just had to know why this lady was so obsessed with these kids, because I was like, people are not this deranged for no reason, and I was right. So spoilers, if you don't want to hear spoilers, I'm gonna say it, but essentially, she, like, had some trauma in relationship to the kids' parents, and so she was gonna get back at the parents by hurting their kids, pretty much. Essentially, she had been tricked into performing an intimate act on someone that she thought was somebody else, and everyone saw it, and she was humiliated. Like, I don't know. I feel like this movie didn't make sense to a lot of people, even after there was the reveal towards the end. So, I don't know. Watch it, and you decide if you think it's a good movie. I feel like the next one is one that I heard a lot of people wanted a trigger warning for, which is the 2017 film Mother, directed by Darren Aronofsky, starring Jennifer Lawrence and Javier Bardem. I remember watching this film and thinking it was extremely interesting and unsettling, and I really enjoyed the film, but I can understand why people would want a trigger warning for it. Not necessarily for, like, the graphic content, although it does have a little bit of graphic content, but more so because of just how intense the film is. And it's considered to be a fantasy drama, but it's psychological horror, to be quite honest. The plot of this film is really interesting and kind of simple because it doesn't sound scary at first. It's essentially that Jennifer Lawrence's character and her husband, Javier Bardem, they move to this, like, countryside house. And it's nice, it's quiet, it's beautiful, but there's something unsettling both within the house as well as when this couple shows up in the middle of the night to their house and they welcome them in. A lot of, like, unsettling things begin to happen. And I don't mean, like, weird things or crazy things. Like, it's not like creepy in the way that like being haunted is creepy. It's creepy in the way that like Uncanny Valley is creepy. And obviously with the title of this film being Mother, there's a lot to do with womanhood, motherhood, and pregnancy and that sort of theme. Again, if you have like, you know, trauma in this sort of area, I wouldn't recommend this film because it definitely touches on those issues in a way that can be triggering. The Nigh House is a 2020 film directed by David Buckner and starring Rebecca Hall. The short synopsis is that a woman discovers a dark secret about her house that her recently deceased husband, who was also an architect, had built. It definitely seems like this film is kind of a mix between this sort of mystery of discovering more and more about her husband, but also in like the supernatural element of the house now sort of being haunted by his late presence because he did like take his own life. So there's like an element of like this sort of remaining or residual energy that he's left, and so it definitely looks like an interesting movie. I can't remember if this ended up on like Hulu or Netflix for a while, but it was on my list and then I just forgot about it. Next is The Perfection. It's a 2018 film directed by Richard Shepard and starring Allison Williams. This film was one that every time I saw a trailer for it, I still didn't really understand what it was about. But from what I understand, it's about a cellist who is sort of struggling in her music journey, and she sort of goes back to her old performance school, her old music school, to like sort of mentor and also like talk to one of the new like star pupils of the school. It sort of makes me think that like if the scene in Black Swan where they go out like dancing and then they come back to have some intimate times together actually happened, but instead of Natalie Portman's character being the victim, it's actually Mila Kunis's character, you know, like that was what I gathered from it. Again, this is a psychological horror film, so there's a lot of like, is this real, is this fake, hallucination, you know, sort of slowly spiraling type of stuff happening. The Stepfather is a 1987 film directed by Joseph Rubin, starring Terry O'Quinn, Jill Sholin, and Shelley Hack. This is one of those films that by the synopsis, like just reading it, could easily just be a Lifetime movie. It's about a man who kills his family and then sort of assumes a new identity and marries a woman with a teenage daughter, and the daughter of course becomes very suspicious of this man, and like it's kind of a cat and mouse type of game. This could easily be a Lifetime movie, and I want to say there probably is a Lifetime movie of the same name. The Strangers is a 2008 film directed by Brian Bertino, starring Liv Tyler and Scott Speedman. The film follows a couple who, after attending one of their friends' weddings, faces a little bit of relationship tension about their own future, but also, as they are staying at the vacation home, things take a really dark turn when these masked strangers show up to their house and try to, I guess, capture them. They spend a lot of time in the film trying to evade these strangers as they start to play more and more like mind games with them. I actually really enjoyed this film because if you went into the film not knowing what it was about, the setup is like absolutely perfect to surprise you when the strangers do show up. And when you find out why the strangers are there, it's even more unsettling to know what's going on. Willard is a 1971 film directed by Daniel Mann, starring Bruce Davison. Willard is about a man who is a little mentally unstable, and when one of his rats that he has as pets gets killed by his boss, he goes on a rampage, and he starts attacking people with his rats. For one, we love a rat king. Two, I would probably do the same thing if somebody killed one of my pets. This film was also followed by a 1972 sequel called Ben, and there was a 2003 remake. also titled Willard. This is one of those films that just kind of comes out of nowhere that's like, oh, that was weird, but like, go off, King. Funny Games is a 1997 film directed by Michael Haneke, or Haneke, depending on how you pronounce that. It stars Suzanne Lothar, Ulrich Muhi, and Arno Frisch. Don't know if I'm pronouncing any of their names right. This is an Austrian film, and it's about how two young men take a family hostage in their vacation home and pretty much play sadistic games with them, just mentally and emotionally torture them. This is one of those films that I'm surprised wasn't farther down, especially because I feel like Us is a very similar film to that, as well as The Strangers is very similar. I don't know if I would put The Strangers and Funny Games on like the same tier because of just how similar they are, but they both have very different like reputations. The next film is a Finnish film that has been on my list for a while. It's called Hatching. It's a 2022 film directed by Hanna Bergholm and starring Siri Solalina. Essentially, a girl finds an egg and decides to bring it home, and when it hatches, the thing inside of it ends up becoming her doppelganger. Not only is it a doppelganger, but it acts upon her repressed emotions, and it seems like she has quite a few of those because her family and she seem to be sort of obsessed with showing that they are the perfect family and have like the perfect image to everyone outside of that. The final film in Tier 3 is the 2016 film The Belo Experiment, and if you watch any of my other videos, you'll know that I recently watched this film. It's directed by Greg McLean, and the main star of it is John Gallagher Jr. However, I would consider this film to also sort of be an ensemble cast because there are quite a few people in it. The film follows a group of office workers as their office begins to shut down all of a sudden during one of their work days, and over the speakers, they are told that they have to kill their coworkers in order to survive. This is one of those things that sounds like something that someone just said, hey, what if? And they just did it. I had mixed feelings about this film. I've heard some people really liked the film and other people were like not a fan. I fall more towards I wasn't really a fan of this film. It's not that it's a bad film. I just feel like the idea and the execution were like not in the same place for me. But those are all the films for Tier 2 and Tier 3. I think I'll be able to do Tier 4, 5, and 6 together just because they are all roughly the same length and they're a little bit shorter. Before I go, I just want to remind you that I'm taking a break before I do the next few tiers just because I want to focus on an episode for the podcast and I want to break it up a little bit so it's not all just the iceberg in here. But yeah, let me know what films you've seen down below or what films were like new to you, or if you think that certain films should be added to this list. Definitely let me know that because if I decide to make an iceberg of my own, I would love to watch and try to include some of those movies that didn't make this list. But that's all I have, so I will see you guys in the next one.